Happy to have everyone here this morning to discuss what we think is a critically important topic, so-called non-cognitive skills. I should open by saying that I think all three of us, and I can probably speak for the absent Burnie, dislike the term non-cognitive skills as much as every other human being who uses it. But because there were so many important things to actually discuss about it, we chose to let other people have that discussion about what would be a better term for that, and we're going to move on to other things. Non-cognitive skills have gotten certainly far too little attention in the policy arena, especially in the past few decades. But we're very happy to see that they're getting increased attention in discussions by teachers, parents, and others. And we think that this is actually a great moment in time to elevate that discussion for a few reasons. One is there seems to be growing recognition that current popular reforms are falling short, pretty far short of what we want them to do. And there's growing discussion of what we can do to remedy the flaws, to fill in the holes, or perhaps change course in some cases. And that opens up a spot for a new conversation, a renewed conversation. Researchers and educators are joining parents and students themselves in pushing policymakers to focus not only on the non-cognitive skills and on the cognitive skills, which we are looking at as, in particular, reading, math, and science that have been the very heavy focus of most education policy and practice discussions, and to make non-cognitive skills a more important and perhaps equally important part of that discussion. Our goal, I should say really Emma's goal, with a little help from me, for this paper was mainly to bring together the key points from a large and growing body of research on this very important topic in an accessible manner, and to do something fairly difficult, to make these points accessible not only to researchers, but also to policymakers and practitioners and advocates, and to do so in a policy-relevant manner. And as such, a subsidiary goal of the paper is to provide a framework for policymaking going forward. And we should stress that this paper really does provide a framework, not a detailed set of instructions or points of what exactly policymakers should be doing. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Emma to summarize key points of a pretty long paper, one that was described by someone in our communications department as epic. I don't think it's, having written 2 epic papers, I could say this one's, don't be scared. This one really is not epic. It's totally doable. You make it sound like it's after which we are going to have, by then, Burnie and also Kathleen give us some key perspective on policy and practice related to NCS. The full biographies, or at least short biographies, are in your packets, so I won't elaborate on them. Emma Garcia is a resident education economist here at the Economic Policy Institute and the author of this paper. She has both far too many names and far too many degrees for me to go into them now. So with that, I will turn it over to Emma.
So welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. This event is co-hosted by the Economic Policy Institute, our education program, and the broader, bolder approach to education. So thanks to Elaine and Christian for organizing. We are very excited to release this paper today, and I am really grateful for all of you who are here to have this conversation on the importance of non-cognitive skills. So as this day was coming closer, I was thinking about how I could best start this conversation around the paper and the topic with you today, and I was exploring different possibilities. I was thinking that I could easily take advantage of the fact that we all in here agree on the importance of non-cognitive skills. More so that we might also agree on the importance of incorporating them in education policy debates as well. Alternatively, I could leave those thoughts aside and focus on the main challenges that impede non-cognitive skills integration into our policy debates. Since I don't want to be overly optimistic or too pessimistic about this, I would like to bring your attention to the end of the paper and express loud my gratitude to those who contributed and helping me to write this report. First of all, I want to thank Elaine for her support and also her cognitive contribution, which you will find throughout the paper, but especially in the policy implication section. Second of all, I would like to acknowledge extremely useful guidance from Jane Quinn from the Children's Aid Society. Also, I'm grateful to Robert Pianta for his comments and to Richard Rothstein for pertinent questions and also for having challenged me to come up with a list of non-cognitive skills that could be important for policy purposes. You will find that our list of non-cognitive skills included in the paper. And to Larry Michel for his advice and for having asked me to write this paper in the first place. He is the director of the education program. Also, a thank you note goes to Michael McCarthy for having edited our report and to our communication staff, especially Dante, who is sitting in the back and these rows. So thanks. Last but not least, to Kathleen and Burnie for having accepted our invitation for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and also to moving our research on this topic forward. So I will now take a few minutes to introduce the structure of the paper and its main contents and conclusions. The paper contends that non-cognitive skills should be an explicit pillar of education policy. We support this by providing a review of the research that convey the importance of non-cognitive skills. We also support this by contrasting this evidence with the way current policies treat non-cognitive skills. In light of this, we will try to suggest some ideas or recommendations on what policy could do in order to incorporate NCS into their situation and activities. From reviewing research on non-cognitive skills, we learned two main things. The first is why non-cognitive skills matter. And very shortly, I'll say that they matter because they matter. They matter because they represent important attributes that we value in people. They also matter because they correlate with other things that we value, as academic performance, earnings, civic participation, and other outcomes children will experience as adults. Second, we learned how non-cognitive skills are generated, where they come from. And we looked in the paper at the importance of the children's environment captured by their social class or socioeconomic status. We also look at the importance of teacher characteristics, school climate, community schools, health clinics, and a number of factors. We also looked at the importance of simultaneous effects, the interdependence between cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And this supports the idea, and I am borrowing this or paraphrasing Olga, who is sitting in the back of our room, that to support the idea that we might not be able to fully boost cognitive skills unless we pay attention to non-cognitive skills. Or alternatively, that by focusing on non-cognitive skills, we might actually get to improve cognitive performance as well. So thanks, Olga. In the paper, you will find a lead review of research conducted by a number of scholars, including Heckman and his co-authors, Angela Duckworth, Durlag, Anthony Brake, Henry Levin, and Jack Shankoff, for example, to cite a few. In short, research affirmed that non-cognitive skills matter greatly, and they can be nurtured in schools. Thus, our point and our contention is that they should be nurtured in school, and education policy should take some action in doing this. Then the question becomes what needs to be done and how. And we provide a number of recommendations in our policy implication section. And the idea is how to help policymakers to make non-cognitive skills a core component of K-12 policies. Our recommendations are, I'll summarize them in 5 points. The first one, to broaden accountability policies. Test-based accountability is not enough. It will leave the development of non-cognitive skills behind, and it might actually be misleading for the development of cognitive skills, as I suggested earlier. Second, we need to rethink our disciplinary policies in school. Some can indeed be at odds with the goal of nurturing non-cognitive skills or harming them. When feasible, we should prefer support and prevention rather than sanctioning. Third, we recommend to learn from and adapt policies and practices that have been successful in other non-traditional education settings, including early childhood education, after-school activities, or special education. Fourth, we suggest to look to districts that are piloting non-cognitive skills-related strategies, and also to state-level and federal-level policies that support such strategies. And finally, to ensure that policy is informed by those closest to the education system, including teachers, parents, and students, but also that other key actors, including foundations, researchers, and all the institutions that you represent here today, play an appropriately balanced role. The policy implication section also includes some advice and some caution for both policymakers and researchers. Indeed, they or we can potentially contribute to better education policies in multiple ways. First, we need improved definitions of non-cognitive skills. We need improved metric systems that are more valid and more reliable. The measurement part is a little behind schedule on this, and we really need that evidence in order to keep understanding why certain non-cognitive skills are important, what roles they play, etc. Further research on non-cognitive skills can boost our knowledge on how education processes work and interventions work as well, and it's important to know how incentives, behavior, and traditional education inputs interact and determine children's learning and performance. In the current context of debates about how to shape education reforms, a renewed focus on non-cognitive skills could provide an opportune chance to enact a more effective education strategy overall. I hope you will enjoy reading the paper. Burnie, Kathleen, I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and also the audiences, and to contributing to move the debate around non-cognitive skills and their roles in policy and research forward. So thank you.
And congratulations, Burnie, on what must be possibly the best timing that's ever happened. I don't want to know how bad it was for you to get here. While I let you catch your breath, I want to kind of highlight one point that Emma made. I know many of them will get highlighted. Oh yeah, you get mic'd up, sorry. By our panelists and also by the audience. One sort of finding or something that Emma and I discussed a lot as we were going through the paper that we thought was interesting was how well what she's called, I think we termed non-traditional or outside kind of the regular realm of K-12 education policy, several education fields have really dived deep for quite a while into the importance of NCS and done a fantastic job. Early childhood really has put whole child, non-cognitive skills, play, creativity, really at the center, really has made it core to policy and practice for a very long time, and there's loads of research, loads of practice, metrics, all kinds of things. The entire after school and summer field, I think to a large extent the same, has long recognized the importance of not just teaching students basic skills, but also engaging students and bringing out unique talents and having after school be a time for this. And similarly, oddly enough, I think special education sort of perhaps naturally with its focus on understanding the unique needs and strengths of each child and making sure to support those and teach to them also has really been a pioneer or a leader in this effort. And so one kind of hopeful thing that we saw was that kind of throughout the education field, there are so many lessons to be learned and practices to be adapted, and great knowledge there. So we felt like that was one very hopeful thing that we saw in the paper. But with that, speaking of maybe less hopeful things, I'm going to, in a moment, turn it over to Burnie to discuss a lot of links between current disciplinary policies and practices and issues with non-cognitive skills. Again, her real full bio is way too long for me to say, and her shorter full bio is in your packets, but Burnie Bond, Edith Burnett Bond, is the Director of Programs at the Albert Shanker Institute, where she works on a range of projects related to educational excellence and equity, unions as advocates for quality, and the support of democracy and democratic institutions in the U.S. and abroad. So she has a relatively, her job's not that important. Previously, she served as Assistant Director of AFT's Educational Issues Department. She was also formerly Director of Research and Publications for the AFL-CIO's International Affairs Department, and also served on the 1992 Clinton transition team at the U.S. Information Agency. And with that, I will turn it over to Burnie to talk about discipline, NCS, and whatever else you would like to tell us.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Sorry I'm late. Very interesting paper. I was reminded while I was reading it about some of the articles that Al Shanker wrote in which he cautioned about the expectation that schools could do everything that society did not do for children. And that to the extent that this would pose a distraction from the core mission of schools, which is to make sure that kids have the academic foundations that they're going to need to succeed in life, that those things are problematic when we turn to schools. On the other hand, he also was very interested in the role of psychology and motivation in terms of achievement. And there has been a lot of research done, as you were saying, in early childhood education. The overlap between cognitive and non-cognitive skills is more recognized and evident, but they overlap and interact in really very many interesting ways. In a lot of ways, what we define as cognitive and non-cognitive is sort of, it's an artificial construct. And there are many things that you could say that when they interact, it's hard to determine which is which. As I said, in early childhood, we know, for example, that play is necessary for the cementing of new knowledge. It gives kids an opportunity to use words, to use concepts, to explore, and a lot of instruction in the academic fields in early childhood to the uninitiated observer would actually look like play, and unless you realize exactly the content and the guidance that teachers have in making sure that there is a lot of background knowledge that's being learned, you wouldn't necessarily know that. There's also a lot of research in secondary, in terms of secondary schools. There's some interesting work by David Yeager at UT Austin, where he has found that a teacher's writing a note saying that they are expecting high things, you have high expectations for you, that's why I'm giving you these comments, and therefore, this is your feedback. And that's the experimental group. The control group just got a note saying, this is your feedback. Especially for African American students, the difference was highly significant. It was about 17% of the students in the control group took the feedback and revised their papers. About 87% did in the experimental group. We also know that there's research showing that the development of cognitive skills are related to strengthening of non-cognitive outcomes. For example, cognitive skills are related to non-cognitive outcomes. There was a research by Bornstein that talks about the development of language competencies in early childhood, keeping behavioral adjustments at bay. And the paper makes a contribution to a discussion about the extent to which interactions and competencies in other areas that are not perceived as academic are really related to academic behavior. In terms of the discipline, we've also found that there is a lot of implicit bias that is unconsciously projected at students, and that they, being inhabitants of the society, also pick up. And in a similar fashion, there have been experiments as to the way that young black men, for example, in high schools are approached in the hallway if they're doing something that is, questionable. That if they are approached as a child, that they will behave and react much differently than if they are approached in a way that they perceive themselves, their manhood, being threatened. And it makes a great difference. There's a lot of programs that are now being implemented in reaction to the discriminatory, both intentionally and non-intentionally, application of harsh disciplinary programs. And we do know that some of the schools that have adopted policies that are not only aimed at discipline, but at making the schools serve more as communities, have seen corresponding academic gains. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Burnie. And actually, Kathleen may in fact speak to a little bit of what you talked about, and I hope we'll have time in the discussion to delve into this a bit more, because disciplinary policies were one of the areas that we focused on, both because we felt like a lot of current disciplinary policies stand in the way of good nurturing, not only of nurturing NCS, but actually, as Emma pointed out, in some cases are clearly causing harm, are really making the development of NCS more difficult or impossible. So I think we will get to that. But with that, I would like to turn it over to Kathleen. Kathleen Melville teaches 9th grade students at the Workshop School, which is a project-based public high school in Philadelphia. She's taught English, Spanish, and drama in Philly and Guatemala City, which has got to be a fairly unusual combination. She is a national board certified teacher and a co-founder of Teachers Lead Philly, and also a member of the CTQ Collaboratory, which I promised I would not forget in the intro. She sent me too short an intro, so you should feel free to Google her and look her up. And with that, I will turn it over to Kathleen to talk about what happens in schools that works and doesn't work and what we could do better.
Sure, yeah. So I'd like to start by elaborating just a little bit on the school that I'm coming from, because it's a pretty unique place, the Workshop School in Philadelphia. I'm new there, and the school is fairly new, and it was really, in some ways, it was really founded on the idea that until we address non-cognitive skills, we can't hope to make any progress with cognitive skills. It was founded by teachers who worked in a really, really difficult school in West Philadelphia High School, and just found that they weren't making a lot of progress with students because they were so completely disengaged from school. School had broken so many promises to them. School was a place that they hated. And so these 3 teachers got together and said, what if we could create a place that really engaged students, that really valued them as human beings, and that tried to create a community that sought the best in everybody who came in. And it's a really messy process to try to do that, especially given the policy constraints in education right now. But it's really worth it. And I really love being there. I really love my colleagues. And I think, for the most part, they might not tell you this, but I think my students really love being there too. So it's a pretty special place. And the way that it looks is I have a group of 15 students that I work with all morning for about 3.5 hours. And we work on projects together. We start every morning with a circle, and we end every day with a circle. So we kind of draw on restorative practices and really getting to know each other as people, understanding that what's going on in students' lives really, really informs their behavior and what they're going to be able to do in school. So recently what that's looked like, and I wrote a post about this for Teaching Tolerance. So if you want to know a little bit more about what we've been doing, there's a post there about it. But we have been talking about Ferguson. We've been looking at the media and the stereotypes of young people of color in the media, and looking at ways that we can produce media that's more representative of us. So that's been really great. And reading the paper, Emma's paper, I was really happy to see attention being paid to non-cognitive skills. I think it's so important. And I think most teachers, if they're given the freedom, want to focus on non-cognitive skills. That's why most of us get into teaching, is because we want to connect with students and we want to build relationships with students and we want to see them reach their potential, which really can't happen if you don't feel good about yourself, if you don't feel connected to other people, if you don't feel valued as a human being. So I'm really happy to see the paper come out, and I wanted to thank you for the work that you've done. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles that I feel like teachers face in trying to address non-cognitive skills, and also give a couple suggestions or recommendations for folks like you who are here in the halls of power while I'm in the halls of my classroom and my school. Some of the obstacles that I and my colleagues and my students face. Over-testing is one of them. My students take so many tests and are so over-tested. And I think that there's a way in which that shifts policy because there's this incredible emphasis on reading and math and science, like Elaine said. But there's also a way in which that really shifts what the experience of school is like for kids. My kids have come to associate school with a place that makes you feel bad about what you don't know. And there's real trauma involved in that. And I often think of my work with my students as going in every day to try to undo that trauma and to make them feel like school is a place where you can be appreciated and where you can do good work that matters. And so less testing would be a huge step in the right direction, I feel like, for developing non-cognitive skills. The less testing that I have to do with my kids, the more time I can spend with them on circle, getting to know each other and sort of healing from a lot of the things that have happened in their lives, both in school and outside of school. There's some really great research happening right now, actually coming out of Philadelphia, on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We're lucky enough in Philly to have a whole newspaper that's devoted to our schools. It's called the Philadelphia Public School Notebook. And their December issue is all about behavioral health and some of the research in Philly coming out about adverse childhood experiences. And while the research itself is kind of devastating, I'm really heartened to see the research happening because we're starting to see really clear connections between adverse childhood experiences, trauma, basically, that kids go through. And I can say 100% of my students have faced trauma in their childhoods and are continuing to face trauma on a daily basis, whether it's parents in prison, whether it's proximity to violence, whether it's abuse or neglect. They face those things every day, and then it puts them at risk for chronic illnesses. It puts them at risk for, all kinds of difficulties in the social and academic arenas. And I like to see school as a place where we can sort of come together and work on healing some of those things and moving forwards from some of those things. But as teachers, we're rarely ever granted the time or the resources or just sort of the purpose, the sense of purpose to do that. So I'm lucky to be in the school that I'm in where we are sort of given that latitude to address those things and encouraged to address those things. But most teachers, I think, are not and are sort of constantly fighting to try to have the time and the space to connect with their students around those things. So yeah, over-testing. Underfunding is a major issue in Philadelphia and really I think across Pennsylvania and across the country. In Philly, our budget has been slashed left and right, and we've lost counselors and nurses, and a lot of the connective tissue that makes schools safe places and healthy places, we're skin and bones. And that means that teachers are worn out and kids are worn out, and there are just so many fewer adults for children to have meaningful relationships with and to develop those positive skills, social and emotional skills. And also there's so many ways that takes a toll. There's fewer people to help act as liaisons to bring in some of the important services that do exist in the community. We have great people doing great work in Philly, but unless there's somebody with at least a spare hour in the week who can say, I know 5 kids who could really benefit from this program, let me help you connect them, then it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, and schools are just like these sort of shells with prescribed curricula and testing happening, but none of the rich and vibrant relationships that make developing non-cognitive skills possible. So over-testing, underfunding, and then also the disciplinary policies. And I know that there's not very many people championing zero tolerance policies anymore. People don't, enough research has come out to show why that is so disastrous, especially for our young men of color. But there's still a really strong legacy in our schools and in our classrooms of that sort of cultural shift that happened in the 90s. And so even if there aren't sort of policy level folks talking about it, the reality in schools is that, there are a lot of schools in Philadelphia that are paying for private security guards instead of teachers, paying for private security guards instead of counselors. I see it especially in charter schools that have a little bit more latitude with their budgets and are using their budgets to hire basically school cops. And that's where I see a lot of trauma that's actually happening in schools, where there are encounters between police officers and students, usually poor students of color, that are really traumatizing, and where kids are getting sort of funneled into the school to prison pipeline. And so when that's the emphasis, it really makes it difficult to create a climate and a culture where we're nurturing non-cognitive skills. I guess my 3 recommendations have to do with one, sort of being, while I think that non-cognitive skills are really, really important, to be wary of curricula, behaviorist curricula that claim to make improvements in students' behavior. Another thing that I see mostly in charter schools, again, is these kinds of curricula that are only ever employed in poor communities of color, where it's sort of about, what we can do is what kids are missing is grit and persistence. And so we're going to train them. We're going to mandate and measure and make sure that our kids are trying hard all the time, that they're tracking teachers' eyeballs. And we're going to show them really how to be like white people. And I think it's really, really problematic, even though it sort of can make a lot of claims to, improvements in behavior. But I think a lot of them are undergirded by these kinds of punitive disciplinary policies, track your teacher's eyeballs or else. And that they're not actually addressing sort of some of the root causes of students' misbehavior, or really building the kinds of communities where good things can happen. And so I didn't see any reference to that kind of thing in your paper, which I was really glad to see, not sort of like, here's a prescribed curricula that all teachers can use to make sure students are saying only positive things, or, I think we want to, engender in students like the ability to be really aware of the causes for, for the kinds of, the violence and the trauma that's happening in communities. Let's see. So yeah, being wary of prescribed curricula. And also, because I think that they really focus a lot on sort of like a human capital model of like how can we get how can we get to the point where we can measure, for an individual child, what their level of non-cognitive skills are. And so I guess that sort of brings me to the other point of sort of like when we have that human capital model and that emphasis on measurement, a lot of times what that leads to is mandates around, okay, we must have all children at this level of non-cognitive skills within the next 10 years, and I think there was a really clear warning in the paper about, we've seen how that worked with No Child Left Behind, setting these, putting all of this emphasis on measurement and setting pretty unrealistic targets about what we can do. Oftentimes we figure out a way to measure something and then the immediate consequence is now let's set a standard and a bar and then yell at anybody who can't get there. And so, I think it's important to be really wary of that and to learn from what happened with No Child Left Behind, and instead of just setting high bars, it's always important to set high expectations, always. Like no one would say we shouldn't do that. But to really focus on, okay, what are the conditions that need to be created for us to make progress in this area? So instead of just let's develop a really precise, reliable way to measure these things, I know that's important, but what can we do as researchers to really define clearly what are the conditions that teachers and students need in order to be successful in this area? And that's kind of this idea of reciprocal accountability, not just how can we set the bar and then hold you to it, but what can we ask of our policymakers and of the people who are funding education? What can we ask of them to say, these are the conditions we need in order to make a difference for students? We need at least 15 minutes of recess a day. We need to make sure we have systems in place so that every child can have a meaningful relationship with at least one adult in school. And that doesn't happen when the teacher-to-student ratio is 1 to 150. What are the concrete conditions that we need to see in school, and what would it cost? Because I think there's always this sense that, okay, we're going to set the bar really, really high, and we've done our part by setting the bar high, but without looking at what does it really cost to get there, or what systems need to be in place to get there. What do our priorities need to be if we want to get there? And how do we build that, instead of that human capital, how do we build that social capital? How do we look at school climate and school culture and school communities? And then my last piece is sort of like, I think the best way to push policy in that direction is by incorporating and elevating more teacher and student voices. Because like I said, this is the direction that teachers want to go in. And so how can we elevate those stories from teachers' classrooms, from students? Most teachers are hungering to be advocates for their students. And so, and it's very, very rare to see teachers on sort of the front lines in these policy discussions. That's something that my organization in Philly, Teachers Lead Philly, strives to do. And I'm really thankful to have been invited, because I think that shows a lot in terms of, what BBA and EPI are doing around, trying to get teachers' voices a little bit higher up in the policy discussion. because I think that's one of the places where it can come from. And when I think about my school and the type of school that we run, teachers really want to work at my school. Parents and families really want to send their kids to a school that cares about children's social, emotional skills. And kids really want to be there. So where's the disconnect? And how can we help to sort of close that disconnect by putting families and teachers and students' voices first?
So obviously, this is why we ask awesome teachers to be on our panel, to make everybody more informed and more happy. I actually think I'll end this part of it by saying I think Kathleen showed a very interesting dichotomy that's going on right now, where sort of policy and practice are disconnecting in two odd ways. One of them is that we know a ton about things that don't work with respect to accountability and discipline policies that are very counterproductive, and yet we're way behind on that because policy is sort of lagging. Like policy is kind of the tail end of that tail where it's still happening, even though we know that it works really badly. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we're kind of ahead in the other way. Policy is already, as I think Emma worried, I worried, Kathleen worried, Burnie worried, exactly as Kathleen said, that once if we could just figure out any metric for this, the first thing we're going to do is jump on it and set lots and lots and lots of standards, which is way ahead of where we ought to be. We need to first take 10 steps back and really think, oh my God, what did we do over the last 20 years that really made a mess when it came to doing that with other sets of skills? How can we avoid repeating that? And that's something we need to think about. So with the theme of non-cognitive skills, one of the things we learned from writing this paper is that this is absolutely the longest time that anybody can sit still and listen to even very riveting people talk about a critically important topic. So we're going to break it up for 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to hand out a survey to all of you, and we should have warned you to bring pens ahead of time. And the survey is important to us for two reasons, both long-term and immediate. In the long term, it's important because to us, EPI and BBA, this is the beginning of a long conversation, research, advocacy, and policy work that we want to do around NCS. And we want you to help inform us, just as we want voices like Burnie's and Kathleen's to inform what we do going forward. More immediately, at the end of the survey, as a sort of reward for you, there is a space if you've got a question to pose to a particular panelist, to the panel as a whole, or to your fellow audience members, please put it in there and we will incorporate it into the Q&A. Feel free to use this time to stand up, stretch your legs, have recess, have coffee, have a bagel, and we'll reconvene in 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you for discussion and Q&A. actually had the attention of researchers for forever. I mean, it's not like we haven't known societally or as human beings that being human beings doesn't, matters. And that these kind of factors, these aspects of being fully developed people matter. We tried to capture as much as we could with a very heavy focus here on capturing key points of research. So we should say this paper is very light on the policy end, on the practical end. And to be very frank, I mean, you should always be honest about this. This is kind of our opening salvo into this area. So there's a lot of great work going on in this area that we're not even aware of yet. And a really big part of a big reason to have these kind of conversations is so that there's an opportunity to sort of bring that work together. Someone just brought to my attention, for example, fantastic work that's been going on that, if anything, has a footnote in this paper, if that. For sure, there's fantastic work by foundations. We tried to highlight several of those that we know of that have been doing good work in this area fairly consistently for a while. A couple challenges that we face. One is that a lot of work in this area, as we've discussed kind of on the panel, has been squelched in recent years, has been overwhelmed by some big foundations and by practices and policies that run counter to the nurturing and the elevating of NCS. And part of it is just maybe us not knowing about things that are going on. It's a big field. And so apologies in advance. And if you are one of those people whose great work is not in here or not in here as much as you think it should be, this is when you'll have a chance to talk about it, and that's one of the reasons to have this panel. And I just also want to say part of Emma's and my goal going forward is to have this be the first of several conversations on this topic, and our hope is to bring in people with much more knowledge about it, who've been engaged in this field for a very long time, who can inform this work, because the goal is to kind of bring all of this together as much as we can. And at the end of this discussion, I'll end by talking about at least one more piece of it that's out right now that we should be aware of. I want to start by posing a couple of questions of my own to the panelists, and they'll be short, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. The first one is an issue that I think really didn't come up in the paper, but that has come up recently, both in education policy writ large and specifically with respect to NCS, and that is the role of the Common Core state standards. And specifically, this is the question I want to pose to the panelists. I think proponents of the Common Core, and I think this discussion has become ridiculously polarized. I mean, who would have thought that a set of standards for kids could become as polarizing as, like, I don't know, abortion? I mean, it really is just, they're the worst thing that ever happened. They will kill off children and implant tin in their brains, or they're the best thing ever. They will solve every problem we've ever created. I mean, these are clearly insane arguments. But I think proponents of the standards will say that what they do offer us is a chance to refocus on non-cognitive skills, to give schools the chance to focus at least on some sets of non-cognitive skills. And some opponents, I think, argue it right now that actually because testing has become a first focus of the Common Core standards for so many districts and states, and possibly even higher stakes and higher emphasis, that it may actually make it ironically harder than it is even now to focus on NCS. And so I'm curious from the panelists to see if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with those who say that the proper implementation of the Common Core is actually even, I think, probably calls for attention to some of the non-cognitive skills that we know are very much related to academic achievement. But it's also true for me that I was thinking about Gandhi's reply when somebody asked him what he thought about British civilization, where he thought it would be a good idea. And the implementation of the Common Core is not anywhere near what it needs to be before testing would come into play, which is the sole focus of a lot of the policy around this. There's no curriculum to go with it. There's no quality materials. There's no there's no guarantee that the tests would be aligned with anything that's being taught in particular in the classroom. There has been some training of teachers around the expectations of the Common Core, but not a whole hell of a lot. And they're rolling out the tests very soon. In a lot of places, there's been, pushback and a delay for having them count, but it still doesn't solve the problem of lack of resources, attention, and focus on implementation, and these being a tool to build the kind of education that we want students to have, rather than a way to measure whether they have attained it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I'm not one of these people who takes a side really on Common Core, because I mostly think of it as a discussion that's going on up here, and teachers, all of the teachers I know are just doing what they know how to do best to engage kids, and it really doesn't matter. They're nice, they're fine, but it doesn't change the way that I do my job, and all of the best teachers I know, it's not changing the way that they do their job either. Yeah, I mean, the way that that I use the standards is, we have to sort of, it's totally a CYA kind of thing. Like, we do the work with kids that we think is going to be meaningful and engaging, and then we say, and these are the standards that we hit. So, I mean, if that's that's working for us so far. And, we're getting to do some really great work with kids. So I guess there's, in the sense that standards are more flexible than, say, a prescribed curriculum, they're useful in that regard, that, as long as I'm addressing the standards, I can kind of do the work that I want to do with my kids. That's been pretty good.
So the last question I'll ask you two before we open up to audience questions is, if you had 5 minutes to sit with Secretary Duncan and you had, let's say, one point that you want to make or convey to him about NCS, what would that point be? I'll leave Emma for last. I'll Kathleen first on this one.
Okay. I think that I would want to talk to, so I have this really big crush, not on Secretary Duncan, but on the education system in Finland. And this is also can be like a really divisive topic, I think. But I really think that in Finland they've taken things really seriously in terms of building an education system that reflects the kind of society that we want to have, building an education system that is meant to educate for democracy. And so I would talk to Secretary Duncan a lot about that. I think they have a lot to teach us about non-cognitive skills. Kids spend a ton of time playing, and kids spend a ton of time working together and building relationships with their teachers. And so that's probably what I would want to talk to him about, is how could we sort of shift in that direction.
Great.
Learn from them.
Burnie? You may have actually done this before, so this may not be hypothetical for, I don't know.
I guess I would suggest to him that he stop listening to economists in terms of what...
Them's fighting words in this office. Sorry.
In terms of what corporations do and don't do well, and what corporate reform should be like.
Okay.
But instead talk to researchers who actually look at businesses and business practice, business school researchers, for example, who would tell you that a lot of the things that are being pushed have failed time and time again in the corporate world and are not respected as policy. One of the prime things that most people in the business world will tell you is that one of the most successful models is corporations that respect workers, treat them well, and have a sense of community and contribution to the goals of the company. And that is not evident in a lot of, again, the policies that are being pushed right now, which is to think about it from the bottom up rather than the top down.
I guess I would divide my 5 minutes into two pieces. I would spend 1 minute kind of telling him what I basically told you this morning, what we've learned just by looking at substantial research going on over decades, some by economists, but not only by economists, on this topic that we are discussing about today. So that would be basically 1 minute. And then I guess as a researcher, I would just pose to him questions, a number of questions. And instead of perhaps thinking back and asking him why we are at this point and why we have not set up the right conditions, not given teachers voices or roles in the debate, I would just try to ask him how to move this forward and how to improve the system forward. And another thing I'm very curious when I read policy decisions and discussions is how those end up being independent pieces of a puzzle. So I would really try to get from him some information on how to piece or to glue those independent pieces together, how to really make policy a comprehensive strategy that focuses on children's full development or children's learning or their future. So I see policies as independent agents that just come up and answer some specific minor need. So I would just try to ask him how to improve that and perhaps change that so that policy in singular works better.
So I'm going to adapt a couple of questions from all of you, one of which I should have brought up a long time ago, so apologies. And that is, can we talk more about what are some essential non-cognitive skills? What are the ones that we're talking about here? And this is something that we discuss in the paper about what have other researchers called them, what do we call them, how do we define them, and all of that. So what I might do is ask each of our panelists to name one or two, and I want to be clear, here we're talking about non-cognitive skills in the education context. So we want to talk about ones both that are relevant to schools and the school context, and that we know or research tells us can and should be nurtured in that context. So maybe I'll mix it up and start with Burnie to maybe nominate a couple of the ones that she might have in mind.
One of the central ones would be persistence. There's, for example, some research showing that the economic outcomes for high school graduates versus high schoolers who took the GED are quite different. Even when you control for IQ and for performance level, academic performance level. And it seems that the kids who were able to actually stick it out in school and graduate have something extra that allows them to perform better in the economic arena and in terms of good jobs, in terms of further education, that there is measurable difference in the income levels going forward between these two groups. So I'd say persistence would be a huge one.
Excellent.
If I could disagree with you, Burnie, that's one. The research around persistence and the way that it's kind of trickled into education policy really bothers me sometimes. Because I find, so, Angela Duckworth at University of Pennsylvania has done a lot of work on grit and how that kids who have grit, and now even teachers who have grit, what they're able to do. And the reason the way it plays out bothers me, well, first of all, let me say that I see grit in my students all the time, and I admire it, and I think it's incredible. Most of a lot of my students are a lot grittier than I am. But that's because they have to go through tremendous hardship every day. And instead of saying, so basically my perspective is instead of saying, we need you to be more gritty to get through this school system that basically tries to rob you of your humanity, why don't we try to make the school system a little bit easier to get through? And so I guess...
There was a reason I didn't say grit.
Okay.
Because I do agree with you on the sort of the use of that word. But I mean, persistence is, again, it's a non-cognitive skill, but it's also something that can be nurtured, not in saying you should have more of it, but in helping students to see the point of what they're doing, helping them have dreams and aspirations that would allow them to keep going even when it gets tough. That it's more complex than just saying saying grit makes it seem like it's something innate. You know, some kids are hardy and some are not, but you know, but the persistence is something that is nurtured in some kids from birth and some kids not, and those kids who need extra support should be able to receive it as they make their way through school.
Yeah, I agree, and I just get nervous when I hear it talked about, especially in policy circles, because of the way it ends up trickling down. And so I would agree that there are certain things that allow kids to be more persistent, right? Those are things like being really engaged with the work that they're doing, seeing, having mentors who have been persistent and have reached goals. So I would focus on those conditions, again, the conditions,
It's conditions, yeah,
that allow kids to be persistent, because when we just say persistence, then it becomes an individual, measurable trait that we're trying to promote in individual children, and instead of looking at the conditions that allow kids want to be persistent, they want to try hard, and they want to feel good about that. But when we see it as sort of like we have this real deficit of persistence in our children, and always when we're talking about that, we're talking about poor children and children and children of color. And so when we think about it from sort of like we have a deficit of persistence, what can we do to increase persistence? I just think that model always leads to outcomes that are not really aligned with what we're trying to do.
I want to make two really quick comments on this one and then go to Emma. One is I really want to thank both of you, because I think this is the kind of conversation that needs to be had before we do stupid stuff with this set of metrics. I want to point out there's a couple of blog commentaries in your packets related, various things that we've written. But I want to give a shout out to one that Kathleen wrote with a tiny bit of input from me, in which one of her lines that was exactly this really caught me. And that was, my students are so unbelievably gritty already. The last thing that they need is more grit. And I thought about my kids who could use some grit. And so I think she is spot on that one. So I think these are exactly the things we need to think about. And I think we also need to be very careful, and I think you both did a great job of pointing it out, not to be looking at this from a deficit perspective. One of the other things that non-cognitive skills discussions lets us do is look at the huge strengths of some of the kids who we are always thinking about as having deficits. For example, my kids, who will be thought of as hugely strong in the academic world, completely lack grit, because what opportunity have they had to survive anything difficult? None. They had a dog die who was 13 and a half years old. I mean, really, they just don't, they can get a lot of grit. So I think let's make sure that as we have this conversation, we also balance it with what can we learn from kids who've actually learned to be gritty, who've learned to be persistent, who've done all kinds of things. How do we build on everyone's strengths better instead of taking a deficit perspective of everything? And with that, we talked to...
What I wanted to say is that this conversation that Burnie and Kathleen just had kind of mimics multiple conversations that Elaine and I have had ourselves about which skills to include and which not to include in our list. You will find the list on page 7, and it builds on kind of combining some skills that researchers had suggested could be called or be incorporated in the non-cognitive list. But it's also very important to think deeper in what they said, because they both mentioned different aspects that have to do with the importance of coming up not just with the list, but with the right definition for all these non-cognitive skills that are going to be relevant for education purposes. So we are not talking about personalities, we are not talking about deficits. We might want to talk about non-cognitive skills that will help students to succeed in school, that school teachers mostly will have a chance to contribute to, and most importantly, to look at them from a developmental perspective. So it's not just your level of persistence. Persistence is in our list. Grit is not, but look at them from these improvements or development which are going to be able to, improvements throughout school years or their lives and so on, not from a punishment deficit approach. So, yeah.
I'll mention one other one. So, for example, creativity, I think, is there. And we talk about this. And I think this is important because, again, this is a conversation Emma and I had. And part of what we thought this brought out was a lesson for cognitive skills as well. And that is part of the problem that we're having with assessments, with measurements, with so-called accountability, which I don't really think are even really accountability measures, is we also are not recognizing normal, healthy, whatever you want to call it, variation, right? So part of our problem is that, and we, again, it's something that common sense tells us. We don't even need research to tell us this. We're not all going to be math geniuses, and we're not all going to be great writers, and we're also not all going to be the most creative human beings in the world. So really, what are we trying to do as schools? Part of it is we want to make sure that kids have the chance to develop a baseline, sufficient amount of basic stuff they need to thrive in school and life. And beyond that, there's tons of variation that's healthy and natural and good, because we do not want to produce a nation of physicists or of algebra geniuses or only of artists. But we want to, kind of help kids develop their strengths and do what they're doing. So part of the discussion we have in the paper that I really hope will carry over into the cognitive realm is to talk about normal variation and to be very cautious as we do metrics and all of that about what, and you talked about, we've hit this dangerous spot of all kids should be proficient at something. Do we really think that all kids should be proficient at calculus? Do we really think that all kids should be the best writers? So I think these are, again, discussions we should be exploring. I want to end the official discussion, but we certainly, I want to ask one question here, and if we have time, I'll grab one from the audience. Here's what one of you asked. What's the proper balance that schools should have in developing or nurturing NCS versus cognitive skills, and should we even be thinking about it that way? Which I think is also important. And I'll go backwards this way. Let's start with Emma.
I'll be brief on answering this. We mentioned in the paper some different strategies that have been found to promote both types of skill at the same time. So by promoting some non-cognitive skills, you will be able to help kids. We got different examples this morning as well on this. You will be able to promote more confidence, and more confidence will lead to better performance in calculus and algebra and writing and English and everything. So this balance is not half and half or 3/4 and 1/4. Is to really understand how these things work together, and then to reinforce and nurture learning and development of children. So that's what I would say.
I guess I would go back to what I started with, that it's important always to keep in sight the academic purposes of school. But with that said, you cannot, as Kathleen was saying, you can't really teach kids unless the conditions are there for them to receive the learning. So if they are hungry, they're not going to be able to learn, and we provide food programs so that they can eat. If they need nurturance, which all children do, and some, including my own, need more than others. You take the steps that are needed to provide what the child needs. The academic goal should not fall off the table, should always be kept in sight. I don't see this as a contradiction.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it's important to see it sort of the way that Burnie said, like, as these are kind of constructs in some ways and ways to divide things. But I think in really, really great classrooms and in really, really great teaching, you don't see very much of a divide. It's not like, now we're going to take some time to work on our non-cognitive skills, that it's embedded in the fabric of the classroom. That students are doing work that's relevant to them and to each other and to their community, and so all of those skills like collaboration and reaching out for support and building relationships, all of those are sort of embedded in the work that they're doing.
So I want to open it up to see if anyone here has a burning question or contribution before we wrap up, but we'll have a chance to talk. Yes, go ahead, please.
I've already started with part of the 21st century skills, and basically been working on this for about a dozen years now. When we founded it, I was BMEA, and we did a focus group with teachers, and they said exactly what you did. This is exactly why we got into teaching, not to teach kids how to pass, regurgitate what we say. And I encourage people to go to our website, because there's a lot of stuff on it on this issue, p21.org, my little infomercial. I do think, from our experience, that even using the adjective non-cognitive can be problematic. Because the reality is, people early on with NCLB would come to us and say, well, you're against content. You don't want kids to read. You don't want kids to know history. And we would say, how do you critically think about nothing? How do you collaborate? How are you creative about nothing, about air? Basically, these are the key learning skills that kids need to really learn well and to be engaged in their own learning. And I think sometimes if you use the non-cognitive, I know where you're coming from, but I think it suggests a bifurcation that isn't real and is actually damaging. So, I would encourage you not to. That's why we don't use it. And our members are from the corporate world to the education world, and they're just saying we need this in workers, we need this in citizens, we need this in people who are functional. And the way the world is going now, there's so much information. People need to be constantly thinking and learning, and these are the key learning skills. So I really think we need to stop suggesting that they're, adding that non-cognitive to it.
Yep. We agree with you, by the way. As we said, that was one that we decided not to tackle immediately, but we hope to delve into further as we go. One last one, and then we'll wrap up. Amy?
Yeah, one aspect that I have.
Can you introduce yourself real quickly?
My name is Amy Amashiro, and I work for the National Coordinator and also the Education Policy Fellowship Program. And two aspects. One is sort of like in the economist speak, return on investment in terms of being able to teach the non-cognitive skills, which actually allows for more instructional minutes, which kind of speaks to what we're saying and what the teacher was saying, where if the students are able to work cooperatively, and spend more time engaged in instruction, then there's less time being distracted for discipline and things like that. That's one aspect. And the other is the whole system in which the education system is founded, which is competitive. And David Larrabee has a great book on Someone Has to Fail, that sort of speaks this whole aspect of the competition in the school system with the limited resources, that has to be addressed in addition to the desire to have it, people want to do it, and there's not being able to, but the whole system is set up to allow for this 21st century collaboration.
So Thank you both. I think as these 2 points illustrated, this is an enormous topic that needs and will continue to have a lot more attention. There's only so much of it that we can cover in a paper in an hour and a half. We kind of gave it our best shot as an opening salvo. There's tons out there. Please do look at all the footnotes and look at all the resources and discuss with your fellow audience members, because a lot of you here in this room who didn't talk also have lots to contribute. I do want to give a shout out in particular, speaking of great resources, to New America, which put out a fantastic paper just this week that's actually sort of complementary to ours in a way. It's sort of lighter summary of the lighter research. Delves into a lot more detail, which they're very strong on, what's going on in schools and districts and states, and what we can do, what is being done to move policy and practice in the right direction here. And I suspect we'll raise some questions along the lines of what Burnie and Kathleen raised as to whether some of this might already be kind of going into dangerous, territory, and what we need to do to be careful as researchers, advocates, and policymakers going forward. But thank you again so much. We really hope to see you at future events, and thank you so much for your contribution and helping us think as we go forward what we need to focus on. So have a great day.